Hi everybody, this is Teresa from Phoenix Gate Crafts. So how's that New Year's resolution going? So with everything that's going on, with it being, the coronavirus, with it being Lent, with it being just March, I figured now would be a good time to talk about how that New Year's resolution that you made for yourself, primarily with a focus on yarny goodness, and find out how that's going. Typically, New Year's resolutions don't last for more than a month. If you're really strong, usually 2 months. Amazing people manage to go a whole year. I've never been able to go a whole year on any resolution I've done. But also, I don't do New Year's resolutions, and the main reason is that they're not doable by definition. They're a resolution, but just because you resolve to do something does not mean you put in place any techniques to actually make it happen. There's actually quite a few techniques to make a New Year's resolution stick. And just because it may not be going well right now, just because you're having a little trouble with it, or pretty much gave it up after 2 weeks, doesn't really matter. Doesn't mean it has to stay a failure. There are ways to make goals that you can do and come up with plans so that you can actually do them. And I want to do this today with a focus on the Make 9, handling excessive whips, and the plan not to buy yarn. So let's start with goal setting and specifically focus on the Make 9. All right, so my method that I did not come up with for goal setting is being SMART, making SMART goals, because SMART means specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. Each one of these is best used on the Make 9, but any goal you want to make can be used. So be specific. Make 9s are naturally specific. You want to make these 9 projects. That's cool. Measurable. You can tell when you've completed goals by the fact that they get done. You've done this one, but not any of these other 8. Attainable. This is the big question I have with these, because you want your Make 9 to be things. They're not things that you just do in the first 9 days. They're not your typical projects. You want them to be a stretch and a reach, but the thing is, you need them to be doable. You need them to be something that you can actually finish, something that you can get the skills. There's actually a couple of ways to do this. You firstly plan your projects to learn a specific skill. So if all you've ever done is a knit stitch, maybe your first Make 9 should be the purl stitch and make a garter project in nothing but purls. Maybe one of them at that point would be to make a scarf, because a scarf is a long project. Maybe you want to learn how to do yarn overs. You can pick a specific technique to learn. You don't have to have, a super amazing project. You can do something that looks simple, but it's something you've never done before. Last year, about this time, I was really getting into knitting, and the way that I managed to improve once I was finally getting into it was the fact that I chose projects that had a little something that I'd never done before. So like by about January, I had only done knit garter and purl garter, so I decided to make a pair of socks. So I went on to YouTube and I found Marley's My Very First Knit Socks tutorials. There's 6 of them. They're amazing. They're a great way to learn how to do socks, and I love doing socks. So this sock pattern was new and it wasn't difficult, but it had a few new techniques for me. It had knitting in the round. It had knitting stockinette stitch in the round. and it had decreases, which I had never done. So it had knit two together and SSK. And it was actually the perfect way for me to learn how to knit these techniques because you had enough practice, and the cool thing was at the end you had a sock. Then you did it all again to see if you could replicate it, and guess what? You had two socks. By doing that, it was actually attainable because I knew about half of what I already needed to know, and there were just a handful of techniques that I needed to learn. You also don't have to make projects that are all standalone projects. You can also make projects that project number 1 rolls into project number 2. So my example is a project I'm doing right now that is supposed to look like stained glass windows. This is an actual pattern from a book, so I'll link the book on in the description box. But this project is very complicated. So there are a couple of ways that I built up to this project. The first one being that last year I did my very first colorwork sweater. I did the Mountain Mist sweater from Tin Can Knits. I can't show it to you because I gave it to my mom, unfortunately, but it's actually got a very simple yoke pattern, and you learn the basics of color work. Another thing I did was I decided to dye it. That multicolored stained glass look is one yarn that is dyed several different colors. So I decided that I needed to dye my own yarn for this, which when I did my Mountain Mist, I also dyed the yarn for the Mountain Mist. So I got 4 projects out of this one project that could have gone towards my Make 9. So I dyed the yarn for the Mountain Mist, which was one project. I made the Mountain Mist, which was another project. I dyed the yarn for this project, which could have taken several attempts had it not turned out the way I've envisioned. Very possible when you're dealing with food coloring. And then actually making this project. So that's 4 projects in my Make 9 that would have made it so that they built up to the 4th project. So kind of really planning things so that they are attainable, that they're doable, that they're not a struggle. Realizing that making 9 blankets in a year, especially if you're knitting, is probably not possible. You can make 9 lap blankets, and maybe if you want specific patterns of blankets, that would probably be doable, but not 9 queen size blankets. There is a practicality to the projects you choose that needs to be addressed. It's wonderful to have pie in the sky ambitions, but realizing that some of those ambitions might take 2 or 3 years. Also, your projects need to be relevant. What that means is that you need to give a damn about it. You can't just make something because you want to make it because it's a cool idea. You need to make it because you actually want the end result, or you want to give the end result to somebody. For example, I made this scarf. It's beautiful. It looks absolutely amazing on camera. It looks pretty good in real life too. But this was a terrible project for me to choose because I don't like wearing scarves. I have no incentive to wear a scarf because I don't like the feeling of stuff around my neck, as you can see. Also, it's very thick because it's double knitting, and it took forever. We'll talk about that taking forever in a little bit, but it was a very hard project for me to complete because I wasn't going to wear it. I didn't have an inclination. I also live in California in the Central Valley, and although it's kind of a rainy day right now, this is pretty much as bad as it gets, where we might wind up with a night in the 40s. We get one night of snow every year because it finally makes it down below 32 degrees and the snow doesn't stick. So this would be way too warm for me to wear, and I don't like it. And I don't really know anybody who would want it, so I can't give it to anybody. So keeping motivation on this project was very difficult. Um, I originally started it around Christmas ish, New Year's ish. It was after Christmas. And I decided in January it'd be a great January project because it would be cold, right? Well, it wasn't. And um, I wound up working on it a lot and it didn't go very quickly. I didn't feel like there was very much momentum in the middle project. And in the end, you can see that I didn't wind up finishing it. It is this long. That's it. I made it so all you have to do is wrap it around your neck once and stick it into your collar, and you'd have something kind of pretty poking out. Because when it comes down to it, I gave up. But this had no motivation, and instead of being just working on it through January and finishing a 5-foot long scarf, I finished it in mid-March, and it quite clearly is not 5 feet long. The last item on the list is timely. S.M.A.R.T. T is timely. So having a good deadline. Now, some people work well with deadlines. I am very much a give me a list and a deadline and everything will be done by then. However, some people don't work well with solid deadlines. But having at least an idea of when you want the item finished is a good way to measure what you need to do. It's also a good way of kind of making sure you're on track. Because in terms of timeliness, it isn't just in terms of when you need it done. It's also in terms of planning when you need to start, when you should be by a certain point. With this project, I realized that timeliness wasn't going to happen for me because I kind of set a general finish date by the end of January. Then all of a sudden it was February and we were in the fall spring. The fall spring, which by the way lasted for a solid 7 weeks. And then I wound up going and having to kind of reestablish what I wanted for this project because it wasn't getting done at the rate it needed to get done and I was losing motivation. So a cool thing that can happen with any of your Make 9, especially if one of them, it turns out that you've bitten off more than you can chew, is redefining the goal. This also helps if you've decided that you have too many works in progress and you need to finish it. So setting a goal is great, but realizing when you can't do it is also important. And realizing that you need to change what that goal is. So for this one, it was too long. I didn't want to undo what I'd done. I didn't want to rip it out. I might use this next year. You know, we're having a very warm winter this year. Next year might be freezing cold and we might get 2 nights of snow. You never know. So I wanted to have this. I wanted to have something. And most importantly, I wanted a piece to show off. So instead of letting this turn into a UFO, I decided that I was just going to cut the project short. I had 3 charts to go through, and the way it was supposed to go is you go up chart 1, up chart 2, up chart 3, then you go in an exact opposite, reverse chart 3, reverse chart 2, reverse chart 1, so that you wind up with a mirror image, and everything was supposed to work out to about 5 feet long. Clearly, I didn't even make it halfway. I made it to nearly the end of the second chart. I cut off like 2 rows just so that it looked balanced from the beginning to the end. And then I just ended it because there was no way I was going to work on this for any extended length of time. I wasn't going to work on this during the summer. I wanted it off of my work table. So I changed the end result that I wanted. It just needed to be long enough to go around my neck. It didn't have to be able to go around my neck twice and dangle down the front and the back. So realizing where you can change your projects is a great way to get them finished. Go ahead and go into that whip pile. Jada and Stitches has a wonderful process where she determines uh, what her whips are good for. You know, this one she really doesn't want to finish. She wants to repurpose the yarn. She'll unravel it. This one she wants to finish exactly as intended. So she'll work on that one. This other one, she'll be like, okay, you know what? I don't like how this was going towards the original thing, but this is a quick alteration. I can finish it real fast. And then there are some that it was just junk. She hated it. She didn't like the yarn. She threw it away. So determining your whips, you don't have to finish them just because you started them. And sorting them into different piles of finish it quickly, take your time and do it right, unravel, chuck. And you'll be able to dwindle your pile of whips very quickly that way. Also realizing that sometimes you can't work on one project at a time. Sometimes it's hard to keep motivation on a single project. So sometimes it's important to have 2 projects or 3 going at the same time. So basically, I go on one project until I either get bored or frustrated, and then I set it aside and work on something else for a while until I get bored or frustrated. Then I work either back on the first one or on the third one, but I never have more than 3 whips going at a time most of the time. And this isn't counting long-term projects that I'm working on, like I'm doing the Jada and Stitches calendar blanket, so that's going to take the whole year. I'm not counting that. I could also be doing the Moogly Cow, and I'm not doing that this year, but that would be another year-long project that I wouldn't count. So these are ones that you kind of bounce between, because the key with whips is going back to it and also realizing what's getting frustrating and what's demotivating. So if you've got something that's very frustrating, like you're working on something and you just can't get this yarn over technique, or you're having a lot of trouble making your counts balance, whatever the problem is, it might be worthwhile to take a little time, maybe make a swatch instead and practice the technique that you need. So if you've got a 10 stitch repeat on this complex shawl, maybe just make a small little swatch with the pattern and practice it and see if you can get your stitch counts to come out. If there's a complex technique, maybe work a little bit of it in a little swatch. Make sure you read your pattern before you start to see if you can visualize how it's supposed to go. Because if you can picture how it's supposed to go, you can do it with your hands. That's actually a good way to judge if a project is doable for you, is just to read the project. And if you can kind of figure out what they're talking about and what the techniques are, you know you're ready for it. And also do research on any techniques you're not familiar with. You're getting very frustrated because you can't remember knit, yarn over, knit. Watch the video and kind of do it with it. Have some spare yarn on a little swatch to the side that you can practice it on, where it doesn't matter if you're growing stitches or shrinking stitches. It's just a way to practice the technique. And that way, when you're doing it in the project, you've already got it down. Also, realize that some big projects just feel monotonous in the middle. There's this muddled middle that just goes slowly because you're not seeing progress. So, when we start a blanket, we actually feel like we're going fairly quickly. I mean, it might take a half an hour for a row on a queen size blanket, but at least, you can see the difference in each row. You do your first row of double crochets on Bernat blanket yarn, and you've got a row that's this tall. And then you do the second row that's also this tall. All of a sudden you've doubled the length of your blanket. And then you do 50% again for the third, and then you're adding a quarter. And each time you increase a row, you're actually increasing by a smaller percentage of the blanket that's already done, because the blanket's growing. you get to a point where you just can't see that growth. And it doesn't matter if it's knit or crochet, you can't see the growth. So there's a couple of different options. The first option I highly recommend is probably the best way to see progress, is to use a stitch marker. So this is a stitch marker that it doesn't close and it doesn't lock, but you just stick it in. This is a Clover brand, I believe. I picked this up at my local yarn shop. They usually have something akin to this. There's also closing and locking stitch markers that you may prefer because they're not likely to come out if you jostle your project a lot. But what you can do is you can stick it in to your project in the row below where you're currently working. And then as you work, you'll actually be able to see how far you've gotten from your stitch marker. So on slow going projects, if you're working for a half an hour and you've managed to actually get, about an inch done, you'll be able to tell. The other thing I have as a recommendation is to time yourself. This may not be the best technique for things like shawls where they tend to grow each row by adding stitches, but for something like a scarf or something like a blanket where you're working pretty much straight and even, or a sweater, this works pretty well, especially if you're working on the body or a sleeve or something. Basically what it is time yourself. You can time yourself for a row, you can time yourself for a repeat, it really doesn't matter. But knowing how long it takes you to get through a certain amount of the pattern helps you to gauge how much you've probably gotten done. So when I do shawls, I do this on shawls. When I get to about a midway point, I like to know how long it takes me for going forward and going backwards, so 2 rows. So I'll time myself and I'll know that, to go 1 row at this point, it takes me 30 minutes to go forwards and back. So on a knit row, it's probably going to take me about 13 minutes and it's probably going to take me about 17 minutes to do the purl row, because purling takes me longer. I know I'm increasing 4 stitches every 2 rows, but at least this way I have an idea so that if I'm watching an episode of something, I've managed to do a whole repeat. If I watch a movie that's a kid's movie, it's an hour and a half long, I've probably managed to do 3 repeats. If I'm watching an Avengers movie, which is 2.5 hours, I know I've done about 5 repeats. It kind of is an easy way to gauge without having to actually do the stitch marker method, especially if you're like a few friends of mine and you manage to lose all your stitch markers. The last thing I wanted to talk about was anti-behaviors. So this isn't against behaviors, truly. It's actually about, specifically it's about yarn diets and not buying yarn, because each of us has a different reason for buying yarn. It is our consumable good when we're making projects, and it is something that we do need to have on hand for a specific project. But for some of us, buying yarn is its own hobby, and it has its own causes for why we buy. So last year, I didn't go on a yarn diet per se, because diet implies that it's temporary, and I didn't want the new behaviors to be temporary. Yarn diets, deciding to not buy any yarn for a year, only working from stash for a year, is great. But you may not actually learn anything about your buying habits, so that when you actually go next year and allow yourself to buy yarn, you'll go crazy. It's just like when you go off your diet and you binge. And you haven't actually fixed any of your habits that made you decide that this was something worthwhile. Yes, your stash is probably diminished, but you haven't actually addressed any of the issues that made your stash so large in the first place. So I'm going to use myself as an example in this, because last year I challenged myself to not buy yarn unless I needed it. So I didn't have a big enough stash at that time to be able to go an entire year without buying yarn. I might at this point, but there are specific rules I set in place that made it so much more doable to just not go on a spending spree. I realized I needed an excuse to say no to yarn because the habit I was in was very much, I feel like buying yarn. I want yarn. I say yes to wants. I buy yarn. I bring in a big grocery tote bag, and that's my budget. I can fill that with yarn, and I can come home and I can be happy. Who says no to being happy, right? That's what it was all about for me. So what I did was I decided that I would have 2 rules that would allow me to buy yarn. So I'd have 2 excuses to say no to yarn. The first one was I could only buy yarn if I needed this specific yarn for that specific project. As a result, like at Christmas last year, I was making a shawl for my husband's grandmother. She had seen me make a blanket the year before and she really loved how it looked. So I was kind of modeling this shawl off of that blanket. And it needed Red Heart Super Saver in macaw. I love that yarn. I still love that yarn. It is absolutely beautiful, kind of rough, but it wears well with washing. And I had 1 ball of it, but most shawls, if you want to have a pretty decent wrap, need 2. So what I did was I needed 1 ball of macaw. I had enough of another color, black, to make a border. So if I needed it a little bit bigger, I could have fudged with that. And so I bought just the macaw, and then I came home and I finished the project. So it still wound up looking beautiful. I got what I needed, but I didn't wind up spending $50 or $60 on that shopping trip. I spent the $5 or whatever that it cost for just that 1 ball. That saved me so much money, especially since I already had some of the yarn in my stash and I managed to use some of that up. The other thing that's actually more of an allowing me to buy yarn that I don't necessarily need is I am allowed to buy yarn on sale and on clearance. Now, this isn't talking about, Joann Fabrics has a 50% yarn coupon pretty much all the time that you can use if you have their app. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about Hobby Lobby has yarn on sale every other week for 30% off. I'm talking about special sales. Like my local yarn shop every year in January has a bunch of yarn that they sell on clearance. And I was able to buy some beautiful yarn for a fraction of the price that I would normally find it. It actually became affordable. It was amazing. So I did that. That allowed me to buy some stuff that I wouldn't normally buy and add it to my stash. Knit Picks only has an amazing sale on stuff that I use. They have the up to 60% off sale twice a year. They also have, this month, for example, you're able to buy Bear yarn for 20% off, plus they have an additional 15% off coupon going right now at the time of this recording. Who knows about when you're seeing this. So that's kind of a special thing that doesn't happen very often. And if I needed Bear yarn, which I don't, I could feel justified in buying it. So basically, in a situation where I would be saving a lot of money, I can go ahead and buy yarn that I don't necessarily need for a project that I may want later. So by doing this, I actually managed to really reduce the amount of money I spent over the course of the year on yarn. I managed to be able to afford better quality yarn. So that way, I'm not spending a fortune on yarn. I might be getting less, but I'm getting better. And I'm really liking that because my projects as a result have been things that people have actually wanted. And it's been kind of nice working with some really nice yarn. And it's the way I could afford it. So that's one benefit, but there has been another benefit to this because I do allow myself to buy yarn. Realizing my own natural situation that triggered a yarn buying binge. So, because now I have an excuse to say no, there's a thought process that happens whenever I spontaneously want to buy yarn, which is part of what used to get me into trouble. So, I realized that there are two exits on my way home from work that lead to different yarn shops. The first one leads to my local yarn shop, and that always triggers the thought process of, do I want yarn? Because I'll miss that one because they're expensive and I don't go there very often. But the second one, so right after that, is the exit that has the John Fabrics and the Hobby Lobby at it. It also, going the other direction, has the Michaels. But, so at the first exit, I'd be thinking, I'm in a good mood. I'm having a great day. I want to keep this going and buy yarn and kind of keep the happiness going because I realized I don't buy yarn when I'm depressed. When I'm depressed, I rush home, I make dinner, I do whatever I need to do, and then I sit for the entire evening and I knit or I crochet. And that makes me feel better because it's the meditative process that helps me improve my mood and kind of helps me to stop stewing about whatever my problem is and think it through more logically. I'm able to get into a better mindset because of my craft. But when I'm in a good mood, I want to shop for my craft. And that's what I realized I needed to fight against is I'm in a good mood. I want to shop. I have money. I can do this, except I really couldn't because I didn't actually have the money. So by giving myself an excuse to say no, I don't need this. I'm not working on a project right now that needs yarn. I was able to say no, and I'd be able to get myself past that second exit and just head home the rest of the way. And by realizing that, I was able to break that cycle. So last summer, I was very happy. I purchased my business and things were going pretty well. I was enjoying myself. I suddenly realized coming home, I wanted to go yarn shopping a lot, but I managed to fight it off. And I realized that buying yarn when I'm in a good mood is where my addiction lies. And in treating it like an addiction where you can't do things is helping me keep a lid on my finances, and it's really helping me a lot. So one last piece of advice is if you're trying to stop a habit, a good idea is to not focus on just stopping the habit, but having a new habit to focus on. So instead of shopping online for yarn, maybe going on Ravelry and looking at new projects. Restrict yourself to only free patterns, but you can find new patterns that you can then download, print out, and actually start working on. Sitting down with your kids and maybe teaching one of them how to crochet or doing a puzzle. You don't even have to stick to your craft at this point. Doing something with your hands instead of going out or going onto your phone and shopping. Make it a little harder to purchase stuff online. Disconnect credit cards from your Google account so you can't do autofill with your credit cards. That was the big one that I did. Making a rule that you have to clear all new yarn purchases through your significant other. That's something that I found I did. Kind of, if I can justify it to my husband, then I can justify it to myself. So I hope you found these tips and tricks helpful. I hope that you're able to find your own structures that help you with some of your own bad habits and changing them into good habits. I'd like to hear what you recommend and what's worked for you, because what works for me may not be what works for you. And in that case, please put them in the comment section down below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, you know the drill, and have a wonderful day. Bye.